Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Gretchen Martin, and I'm the director of our Fatality Review and Prevention Division here at the Indiana Department of Health. This is the second in a series of trainings that our division has put together to help support you all, our local fatality review teams, and hopefully let you all get to know us a little bit better. So a little bit about myself. I have been with the Department of Health for about 7 years now. And prior to that, I was with the Department of Child Services for 20 years. So I have about 27 years of experience with death scene investigation and the fatality review process. So today we're going to talk about death scene investigations and how important that process is to fatality review and also prevention. So you're going to hear from several subject matter experts and some of our fatality review and prevention staff. Afterwards, we'll be available for questions and maybe a panel discussion. So let's get started, and thank you very much for joining us today. So this is just an overview of what we hope to accomplish today, or some of the objectives. You all can read this, but essentially why death scene investigations are important, how it's related to prevention, also addressing grief and bereavement as part of the DSI, which is really important. And then at the end, we'll go over some resources and some future trainings that are coming up. So for those of you who weren't able to join us for our first training, this is just a very brief overview of our division of fatality review and prevention and some of the programs that we have. We have several fatality review processes, and that's kind of a combination of some are local teams, some are state level teams. We work on community and statewide prevention through community action and some other prevention programs. Today we're going to be talking about death scene investigation and how important that is to the fatality review process and prevention, but we do also conduct death scene investigation trainings, specifically for sudden unexplained infant death. So if you all are in need of SUDI training in your area or another type of death scene investigation training, always feel free to contact us, and we will do what we can to either provide the training or get you connected with someone who can. So fatality review program goals are really the same regardless of the type of review. So you can be conducting a fetal and infant mortality review or the review of a middle-aged man who died by overdose. But the program goals are the same. And so that is really just looking at identifying missed opportunities for prevention, gaps in our systems and services, building those relationships between local stakeholders on prevention and also our system's responses to these deaths, recommending policy and practice changes, and informing local prevention and intervention strategies. So it's essentially really just having a shared understanding of what's available and what's needed. How can we work better together, pool resources, and then the accountability, and I think part of what teams sometimes either don't realize or maybe don't think of is that part of this accountability and how that's related to death scene investigation is that, improving death scene investigations within your community can really be a recommendation that comes from your fatality review process. So, do you have all of the information you need to answer the questions during your review? In a perfect world, we do have all the answers to those questions, but that rarely happens. So kind of looking at, where are we often missing answers to these questions, and how can we get better information from our death scene investigation is really part of this accountability process. So we talked a little bit about this health equity statement at our last training, and we have started using this statement at the beginning of all of our fatality review meetings. And the goal of this is really just to kind of provide a reminder and kind of a baseline and bring everyone on the same page, with an understanding that some families lose loved ones not as a result of an action or behavior, but sometimes it's social factors, like where they live or how much money, and that generations long social and economic inequities result often in adverse health outcomes. And looking at reducing these health disparities through our policies, practices, and organizational systems can help improve opportunities for all Hoosiers. So we have started using this statement at the beginning of all of our meetings. We hope that your teams will either adopt this statement or a statement that's similar, to just kind of, again, provide that equity lens at the beginning of every meeting. So when we talk about incorporating equity into our fatality review process, I think it's also important to talk about how we can incorporate equity in death scene investigations. And I think a good first step is understanding or having an understanding of unconscious or implicit bias, and the fact that unconscious or implicit biases can affect our ability to remain impartial. Our perception can influence not only the way we ask questions or the questions we ask, but also then that in effect can change the response from the surviving family or friends. And these biases then have a potential to change the cause and manner of death. Also understanding our power dynamics on scene. I think one of our subject matter experts will talk a little bit more about this. And then using a standardized death scene investigation will also help build equity. So using things like standardized forms or a standardized approach, again, approaching it the same way, asking the same questions, and using some of the forms we'll talk about a little bit later in this training can help build and incorporate equity in your death scene investigation. So hopefully you all are going to take more than one nugget from this training, but if you only take one, hopefully this will be it, or I think this is a good one, and that's really the understanding that death scene investigation is the front line of prevention. If we don't have good death scene investigations, we don't have great information for prevention. So in a perfect world, we have death scene investigators that are all called immediately. They all work well together. They know their role as part of the investigative team. They know all of the questions to ask, all of the pictures to take, how to document all of this information in their reports. They know to give all of this information to the pathologist, so the pathologist has everything he or she needs to accurately identify the cause and manner of death. All of this information is then transferred to the fatality team, who has everything they need to answer any question that they have as part of their review process. And then this information is put into their data system or their case reporting system. And then we have this really robust information that we can only get from your fatality review teams. I think that's also an important takeaway from this, is that the fatality review is the only place where all of this information is pulled together like this. So in this perfect world scenario, we then have this robust set of data that we can use to inform successful prevention. And while this doesn't always happen, we do have teams that are doing this well. And so I wanted to give you just kind of a brief example from one of our OFR teams about how, this death scene investigation information, if it's collected well, then, we can take this all the way through to prevention. So again, this comes from one of our OFR teams. And then when they were in the process of implementing their team, they really thought that the main issue in their community was overprescribing and doctor shopping. They'd already focused a lot of resources and trainings around this issue, but what they found when they started meeting and reviewing these deaths was one, that they had good information from their death scene investigators. And they started overlaying things like inspect reports, coroner reports, records from criminal justice, DCS, EMS runs, jail reports, and other information. And what they were able to find is that 67% of their decedents had filled a prescription during that time period, but only one individual filled it at more than one pharmacy, and only 2 individuals had more than one prescriber. So their, original hypothesis wasn't really correct. Overprescribing and doctor shopping was not really the issue. So what they did was go back and look at these same deaths, and found that when they went back, they noticed that 36% of the individuals that died had been involved in a divorce. And so 36% is that's a large number. What they found was another 14% of these individuals, when they drilled down deeper, saw that the divorce had occurred less than a year prior to the death. So what they were able to do then with that information is reach out to their court system and judge and asked if they can embed a screening and referral service within their divorce court, and asked if they could provide resources to those going through a divorce so that everyone knew of the treatment and support options and groups within the area. And so that's just a really good example of from death scene to review, and how having that great information can really inform focused prevention. So I think that's just a really great example. So just to kind of follow up from our really great example from our local OFR team, and you guys can kind of read through this, but there are a couple of things I wanted to point out when we talk about the types of records that are needed from death scene investigations for your review process. One is don't forget about fire and EMS. They're on scene a lot of times first before anyone. They're often there before the scene has been altered. They take really good records and document things well, so you can often get a lot of really great information. They also are there a lot of times before people maybe start to get nervous, and you have folks that are leaving the death scene. So again, I think that they're there first and can often provide a lot of information that is either going to be moved or changed or different by the time the other responders arrive. The other thing I wanted to point out here is don't forget to invite them to your review meetings. This is mostly with child fatality review that I've noticed over the years, that often EMS and fire aren't at the table for child fatality review, and I don't know if that's because they are not invited or they aren't really understanding how important they are. So just kind of a reminder to make sure, regardless of the type of review, reach out to EMS and fire, make sure you get their records and invite them to your review meetings. The other thing I wanted to point out here is body cam footage. And I don't know how many teams we have that are actually requesting or getting the body cam footage, but I know we do have one team in particular that gets this often, and it's been extremely helpful in the review process. And I remember one review in particular, it was a near fatality review where the girl attempted to die by suicide, and it would have been an extremely hard situation for the team to understand without the body cam footage. So the body cam footage really helped the team understand like the affect of the stepdad and the conversations between law enforcement and the caregivers. So it was just extremely beneficial, again, for helping the team kind of understand and get a good full picture of what was going on. So here you can see the public health model for prevention. And I think the thing that's really important to point out here is that we really can't do any of this if we have incomplete information. So for example, Casey, who you'll meet next, has been working on our Child Safety Forward grant with the Department of Justice. And essentially what we're doing is working with several communities, and they have gone back and done a 5-year retrospective review of all of their maltreatment deaths. And what we found is that a lot of time drug tests weren't completed at the time of death. So we don't really know, for example, how many of these deaths may be associated with substance use. Also, information like, was there a crib in the home? If it's not documented, then we really can't determine if we have a problem or we just have incomplete information. So again, just kind of another example of why all of this information is extremely important for prevention.
Hi, my name is Casey, and I'm the Child Safety Forward Project Coordinator here at the Fatality Review and Prevention Division. I'm the one that's been sending you all of the calendar invites and emails for these trainings. Now that we've discussed the importance of death scene investigation for prevention purposes and for fatality review teams, we're going to move on to discuss some of the most important parts of a strong investigation. To do that, we're going to hear from Lieutenant Richard Ray. While Lieutenant Ray focuses in on child death investigations, we want to reiterate that the principles he lays out are applicable to all death scene investigations. I'll let him introduce himself now.
Hello, I'm Lieutenant Ray with the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. I've been with the IMPD for almost 20 years and been in investigations in some form or another for the last 14. What makes a strong child death investigation? Good scene management and interagency cooperation. Cooperation between Department of Child Services, the child abuse investigator, medical staff, social services, coroner's office, making sure they all come together to complete a thorough investigation. How does IMPD provide good scene management? IMPD uses the Incident Command System. It's a management tool used for command, control, and coordination of emergency responses of all sizes. ICS allows the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department to work on scenes of all complexities in conjunction with other government agencies, both local and federal, public utilities, and private entities. In addition, the ICS will allow for the use of common terminology and operating procedures for the control of personnel, facilities, equipment, and communications. The mandatory use of ICS is outlined in the National Incident Management System. So what does this mean? It means that one person is in charge, called the incident commander. The incident commander creates an action plan. Number one priority, to protect and preserve life, then protect property and preserve evidence. The ultimate goal is that the incident is resolved when the action plan and objectives have been achieved. In this case, a good and thorough child death investigation. The incident commander could be a patrol officer, usually a street supervisor, but their first duty is to protect life and set up parameters that make that possible. They call EMS and provide first aid, protect property and preserve evidence, so maintaining the crime scene security with one crime scene tape, or personnel to control access into and out of the scene. Call appropriate investigator to the scene, which if it is a child death and the subject responsible for that death is a family member or caregiver, then our protocol is to call child abuse. Once the investigator is on scene, he will work with the incident commander and must always carry out the operation of crime scene investigator. So once the scene is secure, who should be called on the scene of a child death? DCS, coroner, law enforcement, child abuse investigator, EMS, social worker or grief support, interpreters if needed, prosecutor. Establish a chain of command. This is working within the incident command system. Emphasize team mentality. Do this within your jurisdiction. Ensure it's agreed upon and implemented. So once on scene, the law enforcement investigator or child abuse investigator work with DCS, the coroner, to gather information, interview victims, witness, and subjects, to do a thorough investigation. Other things to consider: determine cultural barriers such as language, review available case information, so look back at case histories for police prior reports and investigations, DCS, prior allegations and other instances where DCS was involved. Don't assume someone else is doing it. The most important thing to any investigation is access to data. It's most important to obtain all names, date of births, addresses, phone numbers, and emails of all present and involved in the care of the child. Interview all parties separately. Make sure parents are interviewed separately along with children, so stories cannot be coached or intermingled. Interview along with DCS and social workers, either at the scene or at the hospital, to limit the trauma of witness during multiple interviews. Once all interviews are complete, attempt a doll reenactment, so the investigator, coroner, and medical examiner will know how the child was found, placed, and any impediments that might have been in the way, causing any interference with breathing or obstruction or things that might have been ingested by the child. Circumstances need to be gathered, documented, and shared, so anything about the day that is relevant or anything about the date or time should be shared. Social histories, medical interventions. Was CPR attempted? Was any medication provided? Skeletal survey. Hospitals, usually children's hospitals, automatically take skeletal surveys and x-rays to ensure there's no other injuries that aren't apparently evident, but ensure those are done. Complete all witness interviews. People called, first person contacted, family, relative, to make sure we have a full background and understanding of what occurred to the child. Make sure the scene is documented, either by crime lab or evidence technician. Make sure they collect photographic evidence and video evidence and collect all items relevant to the investigation. Consider using a pre-printed form for your interviews. Witnesses and families will accept it as standard procedure. Avoid using a checklist format for questioning. Remember to stay attentive, jot notes as needed. This form should be a tool and not a distraction. And as always, audio or video record your interviews. Interview versus interrogation. An interrogation is eliciting information from a possible perpetrator, while an interview is a pre-planned conversation. And remember, these interviews will be conducted with families in crisis. It's a difficult time and they'll be devastated, but still need to gather the information necessary to complete a thorough investigation. Examine and address personal biases. Be aware of cultural diversity in your jurisdiction. Grief practices, funeral rituals, and languages. Provide interpreters if necessary. Do not prejudge based upon religion, family structure, lifestyle, or what grief looks like. It can be different in many different people. Remember, your job is the worst day of this family's life. Show empathy. During the interview phase, acknowledge the crisis. Be patient. Remember to use the decedent's name. Ask open-ended questions. Be prepared to answer their questions. Try to gather information only once for your team. That's why it's important to try and interview as team members together. Things to consider to complete a good rounded investigation. Any investigation should start with the search warrant or consent to search form signed and audio recorded before investigators enter a residence. Be sure to do a canvass for any witnesses in and around the decedent's residence or where the death occurred. Psychosocial history. Think about any other problems or school issues the child might have had and follow up with research there. Past medical and surgical history. Be sure to talk to their family physician as well as hospital physician to a full background is obtained. Were they on any medications or therapies? Did they have any recent medical complaints? Usually at the hospital, the investigator and DCS will have the opportunity to review the body with the coroner, make sure that a gross examination is done to observe all parts of the body. In and around the scene, Follow-up can be done to search for other video sources, such as neighbors that have doorbell cameras or other surveillance systems. Follow up with the laboratory to see if there was any toxicology determination in cause of death. Was there any other items abnormal in the decedent? Radiographic examination, were x-rays completed and what were their findings? Also, medical records will need to be followed up and obtained to get the complete history. Most of that information is not obtained until you actually get the records and you can see the full history that was done. Sometimes in an interview with the doctor, you do not obtain all information, so make sure to obtain medical records. What resuscitation efforts were attempted? CPR or medications were they given to the decedent? Things to consider to complete a thorough investigation. Things to remember while investigating infant deaths. Sudden unexplained infant death is not the cause of all infant deaths. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. Only forensic pathologists can diagnose. What else can look like sudden unexplained infant death? Poisoning, genetic hereditary conditions, inflicted internal injuries, asphyxia. Could be unintentional or intentional. The important thing to remember here is that what may present initially as a SUID case may not necessarily be. So it's important that we do a complete investigation and not let initial presentations or information given to us by a parent, guardian, or caregiver determine how we investigate a case. Each case will be investigated thoroughly and completely. So this is something that you might want to rule out and not base your investigating on at the outset. So a complete and thorough crime scene investigation, complete medical history, skeletal surveys, all should be done and completed, and complete all interviews thoroughly. So this can be ruled out and not something to rule toward. Suicide and overdose deaths. Complete a comprehensive investigation and document all information. Toxicology for any suicide or overdose death. Take scene photos of not only body but also any drug-related paraphernalia collected at the scene. Record prescription medications at the location. Document how many should be there versus how many are left. Work with the family to gather information. Social, economic status, life experiences, relationship information, mental health history, medical history, and past suicide-related behaviors. Again, this is information that we want to know at the very beginning, but we still complete a thorough investigation. It's something we want to rule out as opposed to directing our investigation. Prior to autopsy, all investigating entities should meet to gather information and share information to provide to the medical examiner or coroner. The autopsy is a process of the scene investigation. It allows for an overall review of the case information from the different disciplines involved for the benefit of the pathologist and the prosecutor. It provides a tactical review for task assignment and readjustment. Communicate with the prosecutor's office. Provide your prosecutor with up-to-date information on your case. That starts at the scene if necessary. They can provide their insight on your investigation. Ultimately, you'll be providing them with your completed case file. The prosecutor's office will make the ultimate decision on charging information based upon all the evidence. Their input is valuable. If charges are filed and goes to trial, they will be the ones presenting the evidence to a jury. Thanks again. I'm Lieutenant Richard Ray with the IMPD Child Abuse Unit. Thank you for your attention.
Hello everyone, my name is Lauren Savitskis and I am the Suicide and Overdose Fatality Review Program Manager and also serve as the co-chair of the Pediatric Suicide State Subcommittee. The Department of Health has been creating a death investigation form that can be used by multiple agencies including the Coroner's Office, law enforcement, and DCS to help better capture information around the circumstances of a suicide death. Indiana has worked to standardize the investigations and reports of these suicide deaths to better understand how to inform prevention initiatives and reduce the number of suicides in Indiana. Historically, the reports we have been provided by our partners have been anything from pages of documentation to one sentence. The more consistent information that we have available for robust discussion around circumstances, life stressors, scene information, and prior suicide-related behaviors helps us do a better job informing strategies, policies, and procedures around suicide across the state. This form is free for you to use and is already embedded in the Coroner Case Management System as a PDF. You can also find the form on the IDOH website. Our website is getting an update, so the URL above is subject to change. We will send out a PDF of the form after this training. Any death investigator is welcome to use this form. There are also supplemental forms for both youth and adult. Right now, our prevention work at the state is being based off death certificates identified in vital records. The death certificate provides important information about the decedent, the circumstances of death, and the cause of death. If the red circled sections are filled out incorrectly, we potentially identify inappropriate or missed cases, and then public health isn't doing prevention on the right things or to the best of our ability. The pregnancy checkbox, seen at the bottom of your screen circled, informs our case selection for the state's Maternal Mortality Review Committee. While there are other ways we use to link cases, if this box is incorrectly checked, pregnant, our abstractors spend hours tracking down case information and reading reports to verify if there is indeed a pregnancy. Ensuring that the death certificate data is accurate helps better measure health quality, set appropriate public health goals and policies, and direct research and resources to the appropriate need.
Hi, my name is Olivia Hoff, and I am the Sudden Unexpected Infant Death and Sudden Death in the Young, SUID and SDY, Case Registry Grant Coordinator for the Indiana Department of Health. I was also a death investigator with DCS in Marion County for 4 years prior to taking this role. The CDC has created the Sudden Unexpected Infant Death Investigation, or SUDI, form to help standardize death investigations for infants, particularly those who are found in unsafe sleep circumstances. This form helps guide investigators through interviews with families and witnesses to capture all of the circumstances of the child's life from the start of the prenatal care up until that fatal moment. This form is critical to not only the investigation, but also to your reviews. This, along with DAW reenactments, can better assist fatality review teams with picturing the actual scene and being able to identify risk factors, protective factors, and trends to make prevention recommendations. This algorithm was created as part of the SUID-SDY case registry and helps to navigate what a team needs from an investigation to target prevention surrounding safe sleep and infant death. Everything you need to know to complete the algorithm, which should be done for every infant death, is collected in the SUDI form and should also be clearly documented in all the reports. While I know it's really hard to see here, the basics are that every sudden and unexpected infant death should have a scene investigation, should have an autopsy that includes pathology, x-rays, and toxicology, should have detailed information about the place and the position the baby was found, and then also have a reenactment to visualize all of this information together. Often, autopsies related to SUID come back negative, meaning there are no significant findings to give a determined cause of death just based on the body. If the pathologist does not have all the information we just talked about, then they're unable to give the family answers about what happened to their child. Furthermore, the team will not be able to identify adequate prevention recommendations. Lastly, knowing all these facts and what is needed for a review and a complete death scene investigation, your team can make recommendations on what is missing, how to improve investigations, and also how to improve policy and practice. Are there any issues with x-rays not being done, or are they not being completed for every baby? Work with your coroner, your pathologist, and your hospital to make sure everyone knows this is an expectation, no matter if this baby was transported to a hospital or not. Are you not receiving a SUDI form, you're not getting clear documentation, or you're not getting DAW reenactments? Make a recommendation as a team for the agency to submit these crucial pieces into policy and practice to make sure that they are being done at every single scene that happens. And then lastly, really explain to your partners why it's so important. If you as a team don't have all the information from the death investigation, you can't make targeted prevention recommendations. If you can't make recommendations in prevention efforts, then we can't save our babies in Indiana.
We hope you learned something from each of these important pieces of death scene investigation. Now we're going to hear from another expert in the field, a forensic pathologist here in Indiana that has first-hand experience to share with us. Dr. Kaur, we'll turn it over to you.
I'm Dr. Kaur. I'm a forensic pathologist that's been serving with the Indiana State Child Fatality Review Team and the Advanced Review Team for the last several years. I've been asked to talk about the limitations of autopsy, in particular in the context of why scene investigation is important and really must not be ignored. First and foremost, it is impossible to fully interpret an autopsy finding without the context that we have. We can get some information, and in certain situations like a natural death, it may be very straightforward, but unfortunately in the case of a suspicious death, we need to go further than that. For example, various types of traumatic injuries have to be interpreted in context, whether child or adult. Blunt force injuries can be suicide, they can be accidental, or they can be homicide. What appears to be an accident in a child's death may be a totally innocent accident, falling downstairs, falling off a bicycle, but it may also represent neglect or actual child abuse. And as we all know, gunshot wounds may be suicidal, accident, or homicide. Teamwork is vital, of course, in this investigation because there's only 600 forensic pathologists in the entire country, and the possibility of actually having one at every scene is impossible. Therefore, as a forensic pathologist, I'm going to rely upon information from the police, from EMS, first responders, emergency room personnel that may be the first to observe a child. DCS investigations are very important, including SUDI forms and whatever else may be relevant. Coroner investigations may be important, but oftentimes a scene will be disturbed because the victim is removed from the scene and taken to the hospital, so the coroner is going to have to do some backtracking as well. Of course, as a pathologist, I need to have access to all this information, and then as we get into the case, we might find that hospital records are also very important, and we can then retrieve those. But it's essential that we communicate throughout this process so that everybody's on the same page, and for this reason, I have very strongly recommended over the years that someone involved with this investigation attend the autopsy so we can have an ongoing dialogue. It's been taught in coroner training for decades now that the forensic autopsy begins at the scene. And again, until you have the context, you really can't interpret the autopsy by itself. So we need to know circumstances of a death, scene findings, past medical history may be very important. Known and unknown medical interventions can be important. Social history may have some relevance in certain cases. And of course, we will get toxicology information, which comes after the fact when we've drawn blood. Microscopic examination is based upon recovering tissue samples at autopsy, and then finding all these findings then are integrated into the final autopsy report. Again, it can't be done in a vacuum. Case illustration I have from several years ago in the Vigo County Coroner's Office. We had an 11-month-old female playing in the kitchen with a similar toddler sibling. These children apparently like to play in the kitchen, open drawers, take out Tupperware, play with those things, and Mom, it was a way to have them distracted while she did housework in the very next room. Well, it got to be where suddenly it got quiet. She went to investigate and found the child's head pinned between two drawers. Now, if I didn't have a scene reenactment with a doll, trying to describe this properly would have been monumental. It's just hard to wrap around your mind around a statement saying, the child's head is caught between two drawers. Well, how does that happen? But with a simple doll reenactment, it is very clear what happened and very understandable, and therefore made this not a suspicious death, but a tragic accident. Defective cribs may be very important. Again, having seen photographs showing the state of the crib as it was found when the first responders got there is important. Showing the bedding and clothing may be important. Here we've got two different examples of defective cribs. One, they've included a doll reenactment and showed that the child's head actually got wedged between the two sides and resulted in an asphyxial death. Again, doll reenactments are very important. And as we've known just in a recent case in the last month at the advanced review team, we were describing a potential unsafe sleep scenario involving a child and adult at a couch. Unfortunately, the scene as it was described never really stated what position the child was in relative to the adult, what type of couch it was, how soft the cushions were, whether the child was pinned between the back of the couch and the adult or an arm of the couch and the adult. And it was just very confusing, and even after 2 meetings, we still don't have a clear vision of what happened. Simply put, if you don't have a doll yet, get one. They're freely available through DCS, and they're not that expensive if you got to go out and buy one on your own. In closing, I've got 2 slides. I want to go over another case which some of you may have heard about. This is a case made the national news media where if you looked at the autopsy findings in isolation, you really wouldn't know what was going on completely. Autopsy in this case showed blunt force injuries, but they were all very minor and superficial. We had cutaneous blunt force injuries of the forehead, face, and upper lip, mucosal injuries of the lips, cutaneous superficial blunt force injuries of the shoulders, hands, elbows, and legs, and then some superficial pattern contusions, some of which were abraded on the wrist. Now, why would that explain a death, particularly in an adult?
So Dr. Kaur had just a little bit of technical difficulty, so I'm going to finish this slide for him. Basically, there's nothing in this autopsy by itself that explains the death. But if we look at the next slide, in other words, we're going to correlate it with the scene investigation data. We have a pretty good explanation for his death.
This picture, I think, explains it all. And if we have not yet heard about this sort of situation, specifically the George Floyd death, again, you have no significant findings at autopsy, but the context, the scene findings, the recordings, photographs tell an entirely different story than what the autopsy would in isolation. So, very simple way to remember why it's important to have scene investigation, because without it, we would have never gotten this case right.
Hello, I am Lindsay Horsley. I am the Fetal Infant Mortality Review Program Coordinator here at the Division of Fatality Review and Prevention. I'm also a bereaved mother who has spent the last 15 years helping families through their grief journey after a loss. Now that you've heard what makes a strong investigation, let's talk about what we can do for prevention work and how strong postvention can do just that. But before I get too much into bereavement and care support, let's hear from Sharon Burden, who is currently working with the team.
Hi, my name is Sharon Burden, and I am the co-chair of the St. Joseph County Suicide and Overdose Fatality Review Committee. I'm also the executive director of the Alcohol and Addictions Resource Center in South Bend. Our team has been meeting now for 2 years. We started in early 2019 planning on how to get the right people at the table and began meeting in person in May of that year. We continued to meet person to person for a long time until COVID, and now we've been handling our meetings on a virtual basis. As we reviewed our cases, what we often found was that common denominator that many had been subjected to trauma at an early age. For example, it wasn't unusual to find that a decedent had been actively involved with DCS at the time of their passing, but they'd also been a DCS client as a child. Many of the decedents in the case are parents or caregivers for someone else, and those left behind we know can also suffer that trauma when losing someone of that importance to them. We know that the contact that the family would often have was with the police or first responders, but then what happened after that? And one of the things we thought as a team is addressing the question of how we might be able to help with that. The loss of a family member or friend, expected or unexpected, is difficult. We know that grief is a very complicated process. And for those who are in this kind of a very emergency situation when they're losing a loved one to suicide or overdose, there's this sense of what's going to happen next? What do I do? Who do I call? What are my next steps? Do I need a death certificate? What do I do with their personal property? I mean, it's just all kinds of things that cross their mind, and sometimes it's a matter of not knowing where to get started. So what now? What happens next? One of the first pieces of material that we're developing is just a brochure that lists all the different funeral homes in St. Joe County. We think that that'll be a very helpful resource for families when they don't know who to call first. We're developing a brochure for those who have lost someone to suicide and information on the Suicide Survivor Support Group that's run by our Suicide Prevention Center. We're developing a brochure for those who have lost someone to an overdose and information on the Loss from Addictions Grief Group that's run by our Center for Hospice Care. And we're putting together just a practical facts brochure so that during an emotional time they know, where do you get a death certificate? When should you contact the insurance folks about the policies that they've found? How do you write an obituary? In cases where a person has been revived from a drug overdose, we want to make sure that what's left behind is information for family and friends on how they can access and have Narcan on hand. We staffed one case of a gentleman who typically would use toward the end of the day because his wife would be coming home from work shortly after that. And then if there was some kind of a situation, she would be available. On that particular day, the spouse did come home and he was in distress. And she called 911, but by the time the first responders arrived, it was too late. So that's a case where had she had Narcan on hand, could the outcome have been different? We would think so. So we want to make sure that people know that Narcan is available in our community. People can go to free trainings and get a supply. People can go to a Nalox box. It's something that we have on our building. There's also another one in St. Joe County. You can walk up, open the box, take the amount of Narcan that you need, and be on your way. No ID, no filling out forms, nothing. We also want those folks to know that there are a lot of supports in the community for family and friends. We have a group locally called Parents of Addicted Loved Ones, excellent support resource for parents. We have Al-Anon, we have Families Anonymous, we have open NA and AA meetings. Any of those 12-step meetings can be a great support for family members. In cases where the person has attempted suicide and been resuscitated, we want them to have a brochure on understanding suicide and some of the things they can do to have a safety plan in place. We staffed one case where a young lady had overdosed, was hospitalized, and when she returned home from the hospital, was given access to her medication. And within a week of her being discharged from the hospital, she had completed suicide by overdose. So that was a situation where perhaps had the family known that giving that medication back to her put her at even greater risk, they may have been able to come up with a much different plan. And we do want people to know that that first week following a suicide attempt is really a high-risk period of time. We also want to offer them help and community support so that they know that they're not alone in dealing with this. We found that these cases that we've staffed, it's really been a privilege for us. We have learned so much. And we think that the kind of things that we've learned can make a difference in the future. That's our hope. We have a number of other areas that we've taken action on. We've put into place some other procedures as a result of our case reviews, but this presentation really was focusing on how do we help those family members and friends who are going through the grief process when there's a loss, but then also for those who are left behind when a person has been revived, making sure that they know that there's also help in the community. My contact information is on this slide, and if I can be of any help to anyone, I'm more than happy to do so. Thank you so much.
I love the work that Sharon and her team are doing, and I'd love to dive a little more into the bereavement packets and the resources that you can gather and have handy to hand to these families when you speak to them. It's good to remember that although this may not be your first investigation, it very well could be this family's first loss. And everyone will handle their grief differently. So having the resources available to them in one easy to find location is wonderful. In your packets, make sure to include the steps that Sharon had mentioned, logistics, like how do I write an obituary? How do I take care of any insurance policies or any other assets that this loved one may have left behind? Also, be sure to include self-care and grief support resources, both specific and local to your community for in-person options or virtual. As we know, virtual is big these days. Where can you find this information? Definitely reach out to hospital bereavement coordinators and social workers, hospice care facilities, mental health and community agencies, and funeral homes. There are many more places that you can get this information, but those locations are huge in having all the information you might need to give to these families in their time of need. be sure to include resource hotlines in your packet that you give to the families. Some of these resources listed here are just a small handful of the resource hotlines that are available. Dialing 211 here in Indiana for Connect to Help is a great resource for many, many things. There are resources that are provided for, but not limited to, food assistance, clothing, mental health and addiction, healthcare, housing and utility assistance, education and employment, children and family, and tax assistance, just to name a few. Of course, you can also, by calling 211 on your phone, reach the Be Well Crisis Hotline. And definitely be sure to include the National Suicide Hotline. The number is 1-800-273-8255. If you think of any other resource hotlines, definitely be sure to include those in your packet. Another wonderful resource that you can use would be through the Indiana Department of Child Services. It's called the Community Partners for Child Safety. The Community Partners for Child Safety provides home-based case management services that connect families to resources to strengthen the family and prevent child abuse and neglect. Their resources include, but aren't limited to, schools, social service agencies, healthcare providers, public health, hospitals, child care providers, and community mental health agencies. Referrals can be self-made or from a community agency. For more information, please visit www.in.gov and search Community Partners for Child Safety. Let's face it, the work you do is not only very important, but it's hard. It's not for the faint of heart. It's very important that in this process of helping others, that you also take the time to care for yourself. By doing this, go to the gym, find social activities, take care of your mental, spiritual, emotional, physical, and social self. It's important that we do this not only for the people that we help every day, but for our families. It's for you. Take care of you. You do a great job of taking care of others. Don't forget to take care of yourself.
We hope you've enjoyed learning from all the folks that have generously given their time today. We also hope that we've been able to drive home the importance of how death scene investigations are the beginning of good prevention, because without that data, we cannot make informed prevention decisions. We also hope that you'll walk away knowing that addressing grief and bereavement is so important once you're on the scene. We want to ensure that we're helping to alleviate stress rather than add to the stress that a grieving family is already experiencing, and hopefully preventing similar deaths from occurring in the future. So now we're going to move into some resources and further training for those of you that would like to take a little bit of a deeper dive into death scene investigations. This training from the National Center for Fatality Review and Prevention is a really good training. It's very in-depth, and it also offers continuing education credits. This series goes into much more detail than what we've done here today, and we would really encourage you to check this training out if death scene investigation is something that you want to go a little deeper with. And here are a few other resources that are available to you. We will send them out after the training, so don't worry about getting them all written down. But basically, we have the National Association of Medical Examiners website, which includes a death classification guide, a sudden death in the young registry information, the National Violent Death Reporting System information, and case studies. The National Criminal Justice Training Center offers free webinars and more in-depth trainings. The CDC has a really good website with lots of information about the sudden unexpected infant death case registry and also reporting forms that are available there on the CDC website, and we'll also send that out to you afterward. The suicide investigation form that Lauren mentioned earlier in the training is available at this link. And Dr. Kaur also mentioned reenactment dolls, so we wanted you to know that you can also get those from our office, and we will send you Olivia's contact information for that. Last but not least, we want to make sure you know about our next training in the series, which is going to be data, what is it, and why do you need it? The training will focus on why data is vital to fatality review. We've talked about it some today, but we really want to focus in on the ins and outs of where to obtain the data for fatality review and how to best track it so you can do the best prevention work you can for your community. We hope to also hear from some experts that are using their data for prevention work in their own communities. We would also like to ask that you complete a survey for us. The link is in the chat, and we want to hear from you. We want to just ensure that we're tailoring these trainings to exactly what you need. So thank you in advance for taking the time to do the survey for us. Thank you so much for being here with us today. If you have further questions or you want to get in touch with us, please email Penny, our Division Administrative Assistant, and her email address is listed here on the screen. She'll be happy to help point you in the right direction to get your questions answered. And now we're going to move into a time of Q&A. Please feel free to come off of mute to ask any questions that you might have, or you can type them in the chat box. We do have our guest presenters here to help answer questions as well.